Good afternoon, and to choir members and to other people who are here who are not in the choir but are here to enjoy this session. I would like to introduce James Niblock of the class of 1997. James went from Allegheny to Binghamton, where he got a master's degree in choral conducting, taught for 2 years at the University School in Cleveland, and then went to the University of Connecticut, where he studied with Peter Bagley and received his DMA, and his dissertation document was on the music of Morten Luvaas. During the production of that document, he made new editions of several pieces of Luvaas, which we have used in Allegheny and which he used in his doctoral recital. So it is a real pleasure for me to introduce James Niblock.
Welcome. Let's see, there we go. Welcome, thank you very much for being here today. If I could, those of you still coming in particular, if I could encourage you to come down further, there may be some things on the slides that will be more difficult for you to see if you continue to stay further back. And who knows, we might have a chance to sing even. Welcome to Reunion Weekend 2009. I'm really pleased to be here singing in the choir, of course, and was delighted last year to be invited to Allegheny to give a talk about Morten Luvaas, and we were all pleasantly surprised when the room that we were in upstairs here in the campus center overflowed. So, but it's great to see so many people here to, particularly those of you that are singing, to honor our tradition of singing and hopefully to build upon it. As Ward said, my name is James Niblock, class of 1997, and like so many of you, I have gained a great deal from my association with Allegheny, both as a student and particularly as a singer, not the least of which among those gains is that I met my wife Carol in the choir. She's not here, so I'm saying that with a completely genuine spirit. But in the process of doing that, I also found a career for myself. I was an environmental science major for 2 years and then became a fugitive from science in order to major in music. And that has taken me a long way into a happy life with a wife and 2 children, and here I am. So this talk is a bit of a reprise from last year, so if you happened to be here last year, please indulge me if you've memorized the slides, and if anything funny comes up along the way, I'm sure that will be the same material as well. So the first question that I have to pose to you is, why are we here talking about Morten Luvaas? And so for some of you, well, it's obvious. Why wouldn't we be? He's a great man and did all of these wonderful things, and it's an overwhelming kind of rise of spirit in you. But from a historical viewpoint, we need to put a little bit finer a point on it than that. And so one of the points that we can raise, of course, is that he was here first. Well, first is good. I mean, first, if you're Neil Armstrong, is simple enough, you know. So I just step off the ladder, and that's all I have to do, right? But if you're Morten Luvaas, there's a tough road to hoe because you're coming to a remote area in Pennsylvania, and there isn't a known commodity. You're not arriving to a situation. You're arriving to a nebulous bit of not so much. I wouldn't say nothing, but not so much is definitely fair. But luckily, we're talking about a man today who had the vision and the skills to make something in that place. And so we are all beneficiaries of that now. His influence on the musical culture of this region was really significant. And of course, Allegheny folks today talk about the regional draw of the school and where students are coming from and those sorts of things. And in the 1930s, when none of us were so well-traveled, or none of our counterparts would have been so well-traveled, Luvaas still managed to have a profound influence on the culture of this region and brought an aesthetic to Western Pennsylvania and an art that was relatively unknown throughout the United States, much less in farm country here in Western PA. And he also began a tradition of singing at Allegheny that is still cherished today. I don't think I need to give you any more supporting data for that other than to say that there are 204 people here to sing in reunion choir this weekend. And so that is really an astonishing support for the kind of tradition that exists here that started under Morten Luvaas and has been continued under our other fine directors. So what is that tradition? And I'd love to know what you think about that, because I've had to spend several years looking at it from a scholar's point of view. What are the hallmarks of this singing tradition? What makes singing at Allegheny different, you know, from singing at Joe Schmo College in West Peoria? Anyone want to just jump up and sing the gospel? Touring is definitely a part of that, of the history, for sure. Others? A standard of excellence. I think that's just a great place to start. So I may have you come up and turn the letters for me when we get to the next. Yeah. Others? Yeah, singing unaccompanied music is certainly a part of the tradition here as well. Family, that's a great one. You know, that's something that when you sit down with your dissertation committee and you say, you know, this is really about family. They say, well, that's good. Maybe you should put that in the footnote somewhere. But it's a big part of the tradition here. It's a big part of what makes this real for all of us. Roy? He said the girls are better looking. So. Yeah, that again, Tom said that, you know, the synthesis of the liberal arts idea in this musical forum is a big part of that as well. So, as I said, you know, I've had to spend some time looking at it outside of my, you know, my folder number and my choir book. And so, level of performance, I think, is the most important, because there are many programs throughout the country that are old and storied and have had their heyday, but the level of performance here has been consistently high throughout the history of the Allegheny choirs. And the choirs are also a vital part of the campus culture. This is not the case everywhere you go. You can go to some of America's finest liberal arts colleges, and some of the students will say, oh, there's a choir here? I didn't know. Certainly not the case at Allegheny. They are a crossroads for liberal arts students to meet. Students that would not otherwise be studying in the same building and, you know, would be sort of exclusively studying their chemistry and econ in separate places, suddenly are brought into the same room 3 or 4 times a week. And that's a great liberal arts kind of experience. And those students have an opportunity to be great ambassadors for the college, even as recently as welcoming the new president this past year. Singers also demonstrate loyalty to the program, and again, I can tell you that this is not the case everywhere you go. There are often some sort of, you know, some roll takers that just say, what's your name again? And, oh yeah, okay, go sit, your seat's over there. And this is not that kind of place. The family aesthetic that arises in students knowing each other and seeing each other reliably day after day, but also year after year, is a great thing for the students, and it's a great thing for the program and for the institution. So the program exists for students who love to sing, and so if you love to sing, you're there. And you can be there year after year, and that's why it's here. It's for the students. That common bond that's formed is very strong, as many of you know, because I see who you're sitting with. You know, you're sitting with the people that you sang with in the choir, and some of us have been lucky to wed some of those people, so some of us just tried along the way, but others of us actually sealed the deal. So it's amazing to me when people ask about, you know, why I've undertaken this work and what I've done. One of the things that's so exciting for me about this subject is the very thing that we're here to do this weekend. These reunion choirs are just a tremendous intergenerational temporal crossroads, in the same way that students from one side of campus and another are meeting each other every semester here in the choir. I'm meeting folks, you know, that I'm separated from by 20 or 30 or 40 years, and we're sharing, you know, common experiences and a common love for something that we all enjoy doing. And that really stresses the community aspect of choral music, which is a thing that is difficult to preserve in today's culture. So I find that very exciting. Well, in any case, where did Morten Luvaas come from? Well, he was born in Lily, South Dakota, December 1896. 2 parents that were Norwegian immigrants who recently come to the country, along with many, many other Norwegian immigrants in the upper Midwest, and was raised in Moscow, Idaho, one of 9 children. Moscow, Idaho, incidentally, is named after Moscow, Pennsylvania. That probably won't even come up on Jeopardy, but there you have it. One of 9 children, and actually studied some of his musical training came from his older siblings. His older sister Pauline taught him to play the piano. Attendance at church was not optional for the family, and so one of the diversions that was at the children's disposal was to sing in the choir. And so Morten Luvaas took advantage of that, sang in the choir, and that provided exposure to music. Probably the quality of that music is not the kind of music that you were associated with under his teaching, not the quality of music that we're working on here this weekend, but very simple translations of hymn tunes and a somewhat provincial kind of musical culture. He also sang in the quartet at school and played the drums. It was a considerable walk to school, about 2 miles from their house to the school. And I've never been to Moscow, Idaho, but from everything that I've collected and seen, I think it's safe to say that it was uphill both ways. So getting back and forth to school twice in one day, to be at school and then to go back for quartet practice, showed considerable dedication to singing. And when he graduated from Moscow High School, he briefly attended the University of Idaho and Oberlin College, found both of those institutions lacking in various parameters, and eventually transferred to St. Olaf College, where he graduated in the class of 1919. And in his time at St. Olaf, he met the person who was to be a profound influence throughout his life, Ethmelius Christiansen. He played percussion in the St. Olaf band under Christiansen, and like some of you actually who I've spoken to, was sort of shanghaied into singing in the choir as well. So it's important. The association between these 2 men was so important and so influential that it's certainly worth our time to talk a little bit about what Christiansen did and where he came from as well. He came to the US from Norway in 1888, and like many American composers at that time, took on some finishing studies in Europe. It was common even through most of the well-known American composers, Aaron Copland and so forth, that they would take on some finishing studies in Europe following some initial training here in the US. So Christiansen studied at Northwestern, took off for Leipzig for 2 years, and when he returned, he took a job at St. Olaf College and was charged with the mission of building a music department. There was no semblance of a department or a curriculum at that time. And he taught theory and violin and directed the band beginning in 1903. The St. Olaf Band actually is a very significant ensemble. The choir, of course, receives many accolades today. But the band was a very significant ensemble and still is, and actually took the first international tour of a collegiate ensemble in 1906. And by 1909, Christiansen had also taken over the men's and women's glee clubs and integrated those 2 groups to form the St. Olaf Lutheran Choir in 1912. He became a revered figure in choral music and teaching circles and became known for a method that is still today called the Christiansen method. The hallmarks of the Christiansen method are actually not things necessarily related to vocal pedagogy or choral pedagogy, but many of the most notable attributes of it are characteristics that are easily seen. They are things that are related to a method of delivery, a method of presentation. And so you could probably guess what most of these are. Wearing of vestments in the manner of a Lutheran church choir, concealed initial pitches, so the pitches would be shared either backstage before you process or during applause or somehow quietly among the members of the choir. Singing only from memory. Touring was certainly a part of their program as well, and a repertory style of programming that featured recurrence of works on a very regular basis. Not in the way that you might think about conducting your church choir, where every Lent, you sing the same thing for the postlude, but in the sense that certain pieces would come back semester after semester, and there was always a bit of carryover so that the students had the opportunity to continue to hone things and learn some things by osmosis as well. And as the director of the choir, Christiansen also functioned as the chief arranger and composer of that group. I actually have here a little sample of the St. Olaf Choir singing under Ethmelius Christiansen.
Sing unto him.
sorry about the recording quality, but I'm delighted that we have that archival footage to listen to. For those of you that think that Ward was really milking some of the juicy parts in our repertoire today, you can hear in there that some of those things are really protracted. And that might not be the sort of aesthetic that you might think of something being a bit more straight-laced, and that's not quite the case. But in fact, one of the principles that came to be associated with Chris Johnson's method did have to do with the sound, and there was this cardinal principle that your voice really needed to be subordinated to the other voices in the group, and that you could achieve that by attaining certain characteristics individually as a person. And I think maybe there's a bit more theology in that and moralism than musicianship, because that idea has faded considerably over the decades. And when we look today at choirs in that same lineage, the freedom of the singing has continued to increase just a little bit. And we know from acoustic studies today too, that kind of subordination of the voice to one common sound rather than to one common goal doesn't necessarily bring about the desired effect. In any case, though, Luvaas proved to be a true disciple of a person who's frequently been referred to as the Midwest's music master. And like his mentor, Morten Luvaas followed up his American studies with 2 years in Leipzig. He returned to his alma mater to hone his teaching skills. He actually had 2 separate appointments at St. Olaf, the second of which was in the 1923 school year. He made his career teaching at a liberal arts college, obviously this one, formed a mixed choir specializing in short works, a choir which had formerly been 2 separate glee clubs. Luvaas was invited in 1929 to work with the 2 glee clubs here at Allegheny after his Academy Girls' School chorus performed in the chapel the previous year. And some students went to President Beebe and said, we like this guy, we like him, because the guy that we have now, he's not so good. And so Luvaas actually drove down to work with the 2 glee clubs for a while, and then was appointed full-time in 1930 as the first member of the music faculty. And he formed a choir that would be known as the Allegheny Singers. Also, like Chris Johnson, he composed music to suit the needs of his own choirs and to the practices associated with this emerging idea of an a cappella aesthetic. And not just that the music was unaccompanied, but all of those other things that we talked about as part of the package. You know, the vestments and singing things from memory and concealing pitches and taking things on tour and singing them more than 1 year and those kinds of qualities. And he built a strong tradition of touring for his ensembles. Finally, like Chris Johnson, Luvaas relished the idea of molding untrained voices of amateur singers. And so I have a wonderful letter in Norwegian, actually, which I had to have translated from Efmilius Chris Johnson to Luvaas, in which he said, "You can't be frustrated with this work situation that you're speaking of." And this is when Luvaas was teaching at Spokane College in Washington, so we can tell tales about it if we want to. And he said, "There's no reason to be frustrated with the materials that you're working with. If you think the students are inferior, that's an obstacle that's there to make you a superior teacher. Because anyone can take great materials and make something beautiful from that, but it's in working with the flawed materials, it's in working with an incomplete package of resources that you test yourself as a teacher, and that's what you should be doing now." So without even going a full generation ahead, you can already see that the sound there is coalescing in a different way. And there's a loosening of the sound that has continued, I think, over the generations. And so I don't wish to paint a picture of these two people as being the same, or of Morten Luvaas as purely emulating his mentor. Simply not the case. And he had a distinguished career of his own. He combined the separate glee clubs, as I said, in 1930 to form the Allegheny Singers. And the first concert tour of the Allegheny Singers took place in 1932. It's a pretty quick turnaround time. Singers' performances at Town Hall, at the Carnegie Music Hall, and at Severance Hall were noted events in Allegheny's history as well as in the history of the Singers. And Luvaas, as a clinician and a sought-after teacher, taught at the Carnegie Summer Institute, at the Interlochen Arts Camp, and at the Chris Johnson Choral Institute. In 1949, he was presented with the first honorary doctorate in music by St. Olaf College, and his good friend, Olaf Chris Johnson, was able to read the citation for that and present the degree. The Luvaas Scholarship Fund was created in June of 1961. And in 1965, Morten Luvaas retired in declining health, and at that time, as a tribute to him, the ensemble name of the Allegheny Singers was retired as well. So as we look at the influence, I think there are three broad spheres that we can talk about in which Morten Luvaas was an influential figure. Certainly for most of us, first and foremost, was teaching. He was revered and loved by singers, as evidenced by the fact that many of you are sitting here nodding. But he also built the college's early holdings of scores and recordings. He bought the first phonograph player that Allegheny owned and compiled a sizable collection of records to be used in teaching students about the great works of Western classical music. And of course, began what is our current music curriculum. So organized a music curriculum and a department that had not existed previously. The Luvaas influence also continued to spread throughout a broader community as the choir went on tour. And so, of course, that's great publicity for the college. And it allowed Luvaas to disseminate this Chris Johnson method. And I'm convinced that he took equal delight in spreading the gospel, so to speak, as the singers did in traveling to exotic destinations. And so he introduced thousands of people to classical music and choral singing. For those of you that went on tour, you know that I'm saying with a bit of tongue-in-cheek that the destinations were exotic. I love this picture for a number of reasons. This is in 1932, when the singers are lined up to go on their very first choir tour. And there are a couple of things that jump out about it. Number one, I don't think there are that many Alleghenians on the entire campus right now that own long coats, so that's an impressive feature all its own. But the headline over this in the Meadville Tribune read, "Allegheny Singers take special short bus on tour." And that would undoubtedly draw some jeering today. So I'm reminded of that every time I see the photo. But here they are, headed off for their first exotic tour destination, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, in between the two most notable floods. This is just a graph in which I've broken down for you. If we take a look from a publishing standpoint at what Morten Luvaas assembled during his lifetime, he made teaching and performing material available to schools, to churches, to community choirs of every size, of every ability level. And as you know, choirs tend to be imperfect. They tend to be lopsided in their balance. They tend to, not have enough of one thing or too much of another. And he somehow seemed to have produced a great body of works that held something for everyone. If you look, the vast majority of works in the orange piece of the pie there are arrangements. And those are works that use a pre-existing tune, whether it's a hymn tune, a folk tune, some sort of patriotic melody. Tremendous number of those things with high-quality arranging in them. And then just 31 compositions that I was able to find in which there is no source. There's no attribution to a pre-existing source for any of the material there. And just a few editions of works by Brahms, Bortniansky, etc., in which he edited those works because they were available in some form, but probably not a form that was easily presented to choirs. These works still exist in choral libraries throughout the U.S. As a choral director, one of the things that I do is go out and do festivals and workshops with other choirs, and the first step in that process is them sending me a list of what they have in their library. And I'm astounded by how often I see something in those libraries by Morten Luvaas. And over the years, of course, it's been whittled down so they only have 11 copies of it now. But nonetheless, they are there. As I said, in 1949, Olaf Christiansen presented Morten Luvaas to receive an honorary doctorate from St. Olaf College, and his citation speaks very clearly of the reason for his receiving that degree. Through their own merit, his compositions have earned a place on the church and school choir repertoire throughout this country. His compositions are practical. They are written for choirs of limited and advanced abilities. They can be sung by large and small groups. Among Luvaas' compositions, there are appropriate selections for all seasons and occasions. His compositions wear well. They stand up under the severe test of repetition. Many contemporary composers give little consideration to the selection of poetry they set to music. This can never be said of Morten Luvaas. He is himself a poet, a lover of God's creation in nature and in his fellow men. And he goes on to conclude, "It is my pleasure to present Morten Luvaas as a candidate for the degree, Doctor of Music, in recognition of his noteworthy contribution to the literature for a cappella choirs." So we see from this citation that at least one of his peers, in a really formidable institution, has acknowledged that his primary contribution to the field is as a composer and arranger. Now, if you were a conductor and you needed to look at the music of Morten Luvaas, you have to take it from a slightly different view, because as a conductor, you program primarily based on what the voicing of your ensemble is. So, do you have 3 or 4 voices? Do you have 5 to 8 voices in your choir? Do you have multiple choirs, just women, just men? And so this is a breakdown that shows you where most of those works lie. And as you might expect, most of them lie in the mixed choir range, and there's a fairly equal distribution between works for 3 and 4 voices and works for 5 to 8 voices. If a person were so myopic as to only be concerned about the music that their own choir were singing, we would not see this distribution. And so it speaks of larger concern for a broader community of people that are advancing the a cappella choral aesthetic. Furthermore, if you are a singer and you are singing the music of a particular composer, you are probably more likely to remember it not by voicing. Oh, remember those great 5-part pieces we did in 1978? But instead, by the content of the work. You might remember the text, you might remember the accompaniment, you might remember a bit of the tune. And so, yet another way that we can look at what this output contains is just by themes and whether the works are accompanied or not. As you can see, about half of the work is accompanied sacred music. And so that includes things on Christmas themes and otherwise, about a quarter on unaccompanied secular music. So the vast majority of it is, in fact, unaccompanied. But that's not to say that there isn't accompanied music. As you can see, there is accompanied music. And so, there are a few dozen titles, as a matter of fact, with accompaniment. In studying this music, it's true, as Olaf Christiansen said, that some of these works wear well. And when I undertook my study, I came pretty quickly to the conclusion that it's in fact the works that are completely original that wear the best. And so if I'm considering that statement about these works wearing well, and about Luvaas being deeply concerned with the kind of poetry that he chooses, it's in these completely original works where that is made most clear to me. Despite the sentimental attachments that we all have to music that we've known and loved, works like Catherine's Wedding Day and Hope Sa and Boating Song do not have the enduring power to reach a modern audience today because they were in a transitional time period, between the Glee Club music of the 1920s that both the students and Luvaas were anxious to abandon, and the kinds of contemporary things that we see starting in the 1950s, 60s, and up through today. So I think these original works, this little purple slice of the pie, both demonstrate the best craftsmanship, they have the most enduring subjects, and not entirely to my surprise, but perhaps to yours, they were not among the best-selling of his pieces. In fact, it's the works that I mentioned earlier that had a broad popular appeal in the 1930s and 40s that were selling best. Well, several people have come up to me this weekend and said, so what did you change in this piece? We're looking at this page and it has your name on it, what did you change? And I often just say, not much, don't worry about it. But in fact, the reasons why I've undertaken making these new editions is that nearly all Luvaas publications are out of print. Original works, arrangements, everything. There are just a handful of things that are still in print. And the accuracy and accountability of choral music publishing in the 1930s in particular is not very high. And so there are secondary sources for our consideration: sketches, recordings, some of your own marked copies of octavos that are still filed away here in the Allegheny Library. I was able to go through those octavos and look and see, well, all of the altos have a breath mark here, even though that's not in the original. Well, that makes a difference in how to look historically at a work, and whether or not the breath was left out intentionally by Luvaas, whether it was left out inadvertently by the publisher, or whether it is just a matter of taste for conductors to interpret. And of course, correspondence. Correspondence contributed by alumni, correspondence contributed by peers and mentors, and programs, photos, and the like. And finally, the last reason is that I think posterity somewhat demands that these works be preserved in a medium that is not now 50 years old. And so a new audience can in fact benefit from the historical and critical annotations like the kind that I've just described that might illuminate inspiration for the music, or that might just tell us a little bit about how it was performed. And I think it would be especially sad to lose those original works. And so I undertook creating new editions, new performing editions of 5 works. Those works were The Cry of God, O Sing Unto Him, The Pines of Home, Nunc Dimittis, and a piece for women's voices called A Spring Night. Some of you probably remember singing The Cry of God, but you probably have not seen this page. This is a page out of Morten Luvaas' sketchbook in which he outlines the original theme for The Cry of God. And we see there's a baritone solo notated at the top there, and the rest of this stuff that you see here is piano accompaniment. Anyone here ever perform The Cry of God with piano accompaniment? Anyone perform it without piano accompaniment? Okay, so a handful in that club. In fact, the piece was conceived as an accompanied piece, as you can see in the sketch here. And so one of the issues that comes forward is it possible for us to separate in an accurate way whether or not the influence on the piece is brought about by practical constraints of everyday use, and not necessarily by the composer's artistic vision for the piece. One notable alumnus called this one of his best works. I'm speaking of Crawford Doc Thoburn, and I will quote him here. In my estimation, The Cry of God was one of his best works, certainly not avant-garde, even for the time when it was written, but for him, experimental, very successful, and moving for singers and audiences alike. The work was frequently performed without accompaniment. There is a version of it dedicated to Olaf Christiansen and the St. Olaf Choir, and especially when you're on tour, it's infinitely more practical to think of the work in unaccompanied terms. However, it is a very nice piece to perform with accompaniment, and it's clearly conceived as a work with piano accompaniment. You can hear a modern recording of it here. opinion, of course, but I think the piano there really contributes to the lushness of the texture, which, when you hear the choral parts alone, it's quite lush compared to other works of the same time period by Luvaas or even other composers. But then you put it side by side with the piano accompanied version, and it really becomes rhapsodic and romantic, and I think enchanting. So that's one example of what can be gained by looking at some of these sketches and scores. Another example, I think lots of people will say this is a favorite piece of theirs. Here's an early sketch of the Pines of Home, and we can see quite a bit more in this sketch than what we saw in the Cry of God sketch, because the words are lined out in a few places. You can see that the text is, "Who command the sky" is there, and he hasn't quite outlined the harmonic underpinning of that yet, which we all know is a very exciting moment. But we do see here at the beginning the rough structure of what we are singing today, as a matter of fact. So it's great to look at that. I mean, it's wonderful to sit and look at this sketch and think about what's intended. And we can also learn a bit just by contemplating the subject in its simplest form. But one of the most exciting things about this study for me has been looking at it from a human perspective and thinking a little bit more about the dedication, for example, of this piece to Maud Miller Hoffmaster, a sensitive painter of pine trees. Well, these in fact are some of Miss Hoffmaster's pine trees. This is a painting by her, and there are several more of them in the Luvaas archive here in Pelletier Library. And even more telling, I think, is to look at this man with his own pine trees in the background, and not the pine trees of Norway, but the pine trees right here of Crawford County. And undoubtedly, some of those pine trees in the background grace the stage of the chapel during some of your concerts. And I love this picture as well, primarily because he's looking at his friend there, Willie. I don't know if any of you knew Willie, but he's looking at Willie as though Willie just finished planting all the trees. So perhaps fertilizer was Willie's area instead. In any case, let's just take a little bit of a listen here as well. The morning that Morten Luvaas was to receive his honorary doctorate from St. Olaf College, he received a telegram from his son Jay. And the telegram read simply, "Congratulations, doctor. All the trees are in, but no rain yet." And so you can see how that's at the heart not just of one person, but a family. And then another, again referring to some correspondence that I've had with Crawford Thoburn. Thoburn was visiting Meadville just a few years after he'd graduated, and he pulled up to Morten's house, and Morten wasn't there, and he went over to Jay's house, and Luvaas was there, in fact, and he just came out, and without even saying hello, he said, "Let's go for a ride. You've got to see my trees." So it's been a great opportunity for me to look at these works, both introspectively and with a broader view of music in this time period. But I would say, if we're on the subject of questions, today's a great day to ask questions that I don't know the answer to, because there's a chance that we'll never assemble again a group of people who could more easily answer those questions. So I hope it's a time for you to share some things that you know as well. Yes?
One of my strong memories, this is back in 1950, is that there was a great concentration on the letter A. Nobody could say the letter A. It had to be A. I never learned to say A like we would say. And I don't know whether any of you ever had that with the choir, did it?
working on just the right kind of A. Yeah. Boy, it's funny to know someone that really obsesses about vowels that way. Yes? Janet's recollecting both that Ludwig thought everyone could sing and was adamant about forcing people into that situation, and also just being able to see his eyes regardless of the lighting conditions in the chapel. Yes? His family, I'm delighted to point out that Karen Luvaas is here with us today, and I should footnote all of my own work by saying that as a doctoral student, my committee would never have let me undertake, a year or more of just digging through the personal background of a composer like this, because I'm not a musicologist, I'm a conductor. But luckily, I had an Allegheny comprehensive project on which I was able to build my collection of this personal information, and that, of course, was Karen's comp. And so I'm delighted that she's here, and thank her for all of the work that she did. And could you stand up, Karen? They'd like to, yeah. As many of you know, Jay Luvaas passed away earlier this year. Diane Luvaas is still well and living in Minnesota. She has come upon some difficulty with her vision. Over the last few years, it has degenerated very quickly, she was planning on being here this week, but took a fall a few months back. Is that right, Karen? Yeah, and just was having enough trouble getting over that and getting around that she's not able to be here this weekend. Other questions? The question is my work available? And the answer is you could pay, I don't know what it costs, but you could pay the University of Michigan Archive, who, they store all of the doctoral dissertations in the country. You could send them a check for $40 or something like that, and they would send you a copy of my dissertation. Or you could email me, and I could send you a copy of it for the $3 that it costs to mail it. As far as the editions go, the editions that I've been working on, unfortunately, my work has not permitted me in the last couple of years, and more specifically, my children have not permitted me in the last couple of years, to dig through quite all of the copyright mire that is associated with these works having been purchased again and again and again by different companies that are gobbling up smaller and smaller companies. So the copyrights since the 1950s have changed hands for most of the pieces between 5 and 7 times. And so I hope that in the coming year, I have some sabbatic leave time coming up, and I hope that in the coming year that I'll be able to finally dig through the last of that paperwork, although they may be sold 3 more times by then, because I think it would be great for these things to be a bit more widely available. And of course, that was my goal in starting this work to begin with. So, other questions? Yes, Roy? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah, as far as I understand it, the note goes all the way back to the beginning. So it's copyrighted in 1931, and I think it was there in 1930 during Louis' first year with the singers. I've not been able to confirm that with anyone that was there singing at that time, but I think that's the case. Yes?
Is there a difference in size or whatever between choir, chorus, using words interchangeably?
They are used fairly interchangeably, and particularly in the English language, people tend to use them in whatever way rolls out best with the 3 words that have to precede it. So, I think if you're from the Tuscaloosa area, then maybe chorus is not as popular, and it sounds better to have choral tacked onto the end. Sometimes distinctions are made about that. Often an institution will say, well, choir is really a church thing. We should have a chorus, and vice versa. But they're used fairly interchangeably. Yes? Oh, sorry. You're next. Yes?
I'm just wondering if anybody else since 1955 in here, or I heard did recognize.
The question is about overtones and whether or not people, and are you asking about whether or not they were able to hear them today, or whether they heard them?
Is that really one of the movies shows that you played on People Like Me for 10 years?
Oh, yeah. So
It really exists.
Dan's looking for support from people that also did not hear overtones. So if you, maybe we need to form a little, and some hands are going up around the room, so, you know, modestly, but they're there. Yeah, that's right. A support group is probably in order. Yes? Sir.
Okay, the alma mater
I would guess that's the case. I would think that has to be the case.
18.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Noted. We'll put that in the minutes. Others? Yes? I think so. You know, there's a fairly small group of sort of early disciples taking that idea forward. Some of this came out of tours of foreign choirs, actually, that were coming over to the U.S. From European countries and from Russia. And people said, wow, this is really interesting, this is really phenomenal. And so we see a quicker bloom of that in the central part of the country, where there are fewer other cultural venues already in place. So in the central part of the U.S., we don't already have thriving orchestras and ballets and operas and that sort of thing in the 1920s and 30s. And so singing, partly by virtue of being cheap, really takes hold there. But I think that Morten Luvaas is one of the first people to bring that aesthetic this far eastward. The Allegheny Singers are not the first choir of their kind. The Northwestern Choir, founded by Paul Lutkin in 1906, is one of the first co-ed collegiate choirs. And then later on, the Westminster Choir, which has also garnered lots of fame. Its first incarnation in Dayton, Ohio isn't until 1919. Yes, Meg? Yeah, there's a treasure trove of material in the Pelletier Library. I went through, I think, 6 archive boxes of papers and photos. Just wonderful things. Some of them just reminiscences from folks sitting here in the audience. Karen's comp is in there. My dissertation is in there now as well. And there are recordings too. So lots and lots of material there. It's really a wonderful resource, a good preservation and a good resource for people working in the area. That's a great story to hear. I'm glad to hear that, but it's not a thing that I consider very much. The question is, did I consider very much the evolution of the repertoire for the singers and how it was changing over the years? And the example cited is a Sundberg poem set in, when did you say that was? Sang it in 1960 of a very dissonant musical setting with Luvaas saying that the idea was that the choir had grown a little bit too comfortable with their run-of-the-mill Lutheran hymnody. And so I'd like to hear that piece now that you bring it up, but I'll have to look back and see what that is. But no, the answer is no, I didn't really consider very much what the evolution of that repertoire is outside of the few pieces that I mentioned. And so I looked very carefully for times when those pieces were performed. For example, The Cry of God being performed in Tours in 1941, and then being performed the following year by the St. Olaf Choir. So those kinds of things I was scouring a bit. Yes? I don't know that. Does anyone here know when the college started recording concerts? I don't know the answer to that, but you might ask Don Skinner. Don, are you here? Not. But Don was involved in assembling some of those materials on a recent CD, and he might have a better idea. So I do have some LPs that date back, quite a ways, but not in the department, but in Pelletier, although perhaps in the department as well. But that's a thing we could ask around about a little bit. I'm sure that the answer could be readily found in an afternoon. No, but just are they there? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes? Oh boy, I don't think that's a question that I can answer. Karen, do you think you can answer that question? The question was whether or not Luvaas had a favorite piece. Yeah, we're going to have to throw up our hands on that one.
In his last years, when he was bedridden, it was clearly the times of home. As Jay was telling me, he'd lie in that bed and look at the paintings.
Yes.
Wall, and his mind walked the path up to the trees by the lake and relaxed.
Yeah, Jonathan is just relaying the Pines of Home, particularly in the last years of his life, was a great, a source of inspiration and recollection for him, that he'd look at the painting and think about that piece quite a bit. Karen? She just was saying Pines of Home really was kind of a sacred piece, and talking about going out to the tree farm on Sundays, with Willie and occasionally with a guest or two tagging along, and that caring for the trees was really his own sort of spiritual safe haven. So I think that, again, lends credence to this idea that Pines was a very important piece for him.
I was going to ask, I wonder how many people here had the opportunity to go out to it's on the other side of Guy's Mill.
Okay.
Cabin, the thing that, and he was like the singer for us, or like a but once you can move, I've planted trees out there for years. But there were trees in the valley that were full of hemlock, and they were huge, they were like first growth trees. And this would remind me when I saw that one picture. Those trees up there, but now they're part of the national forest.
Mm-hmm. Bob's pointing out that at the tree farm, it was, many of you were out there and planted trees and pruned trees and that sort of thing. But there were also these old growth hemlock trees that were, sort of a vision of the future of the trees that were being planted and pruned, and that was a fun thing to see. Yes? Good, thank you. So she has passed along her thanks to the whole Luvaas family. And so I just want to wrap. First of all, this is for people who were complaining all day yesterday about the fact that I don't carry pictures of my children. Okay? So even those of you that were nodding off could still have a question, obviously. We have sort of our own postlude. And so for those of you that don't sing in the choir or are not here specifically for the choir reunion, we have our own way of finishing business. And it's a tradition that dates back to 1931 and owes its preservation both to Lily and to Right North and to Ward as well. And I want to point out that the inception of all of these great things that we talk about are a wonderful study for us to undertake. But in the here and now, the preservation of those things are very important. And so, just as Ward introduced some of his current students today, We need to acknowledge the work that Wright did and the work that Ward has done in preserving these traditions, which could have just as easily been swept aside. And so I'm very grateful to have been part of this, and I think it helps to make us all one big family. Ward, do you mind if we take time to sing the note right now? Oh, that'd be great. Okay? So, I mean, just in case, if you don't, why don't we stand up? Thank you so much for being here today. I'd be happy to hear from any of you later on that have more questions, so please feel free to get in touch. And if you are singing, please haul yourself up onto the stage quickly.